The Texas Penal Code is similar to the Code of Criminal Procedure in that the first section states what it is designed to do. In this screencast, we'll examine the objectives of the Penal Code and briefly examine how the Penal Code applies exclusively to criminal conduct. The first objective of the Penal Code is to establish a system of prohibitions, penalties, and correctional measures in order to deal with conduct that threatens harm to individual or public interests. Next, to ensure public safety by deterrence, rehabilitation, and punishment in order to prevent reoccurrence of criminal behavior. Next, to define and grade offenses and give warning of what is prohibited and the consequences. In other words, to identify what is against the law and the punishment. Next, prescribe penalties that are proportionate to the offenses and permit recognition of differences in rehabilitation among individuals. Next, to safeguard conduct that is not criminal. For instance, kicking the back seat in front of you on an airplane is not criminal conduct, although maybe it should be. It's not criminal conduct because it's not specifically identified in the Penal Code as such. Citizens are protected from arrest and prosecution for this rude behavior, as well as others such as cutting in line at the store, because they aren't defined in the Penal Code as offenses. Next, to guide and limit the exercise of discretion in law enforcement to prevent arbitrary or oppressive treatment of persons suspected, accused, or convicted of offenses. In most cases, a peace officer has the discretion to arrest or not arrest someone. The Penal Code guides this discretion by indicating which offenses are serious and which ones are less serious. Finally, to define the scope of state interest in law enforcement against specific offenses and to systemize the exercise of state criminal jurisdiction. In other words, the Penal Code seeks to draw a line in the sand about how far the government can get into your business and to systemize or standardize the system so everyone is subject to the same rules and procedures. The Penal Code specifies conduct does not constitute an offense unless it is defined as an offense and lawfully adopted under a statute. That statute could be the Penal Code itself, or other codes like the Health and Safety Code or the Transportation Code. Finally, the Penal Code specifies it does not affect a liability or right in a civil suit. For instance, if you drive drunk, crash, and hurt someone and are found not guilty of intoxication assault, the hurt person can still sue you in civil court. The fact that you were acquitted does not matter in terms of the civil suit. The Penal Code defines many terms which are later used in criminal offenses. This is the first of two screencasts covering Penal Code definitions. First, computation of age. The Penal Code states a person's anniversary of their birthday is the means by which the state should compute their age. The next term defined by the Penal Code is benefit. A benefit is anything reasonably regarded as economic gain or advantage for the actor or another person. For instance, a benefit could be money and jewelry, or it could be concert tickets, or even a contract to do business. The next term is coercion. The Penal Code defines coercion as a threat, however communicated, to commit an offense, inflict bodily injury in the future, accuse a person of any offense, expose a person to hatred, contempt, or ridicule, harm the credit or business reputation of any person, or take or withhold action as a public servant, or cause a public servant to take or withhold action. The next term defined by the Penal Code is conduct. Conduct is an act or an omission and its accompanying mental state. Next, the Penal Code defines deadly weapon. A deadly weapon is a firearm or anything designed, made, or adapted for the purpose of inflicting death or serious bodily injury, or anything used in a way that is capable of causing death or serious bodily injury. For example, a firearm is obviously a deadly weapon. A knife could be a deadly weapon. So could a car, or even a pencil. The manner of use is what's important. The next term defined by the Penal Code is drug. The Penal Code states drug has the same meaning as Health and Safety Code section 481.002. Next, element of an offense. According to the Penal Code, an element of an offense includes the forbidden conduct, the required culpability, the required result, and the negation of any exception to the offense. Next, the Penal Code defines law. Law is considered to be the Constitution of Texas or the United States, the written opinion of a court of record or an order from a county commissioner's court, or rules under statute. An official proceeding is considered by the Penal Code to be any type of administrative, executive, legislative, or judicial proceeding conducted before a public servant. For example, a commissioner's court is considered an official proceeding. The Penal Code defines possession as actual care, custody, control, or management. For instance, if you have narcotics in your pocket, you're considered to be in actual control of them. If there are narcotics hidden in a shed in your neighbor's backyard, your neighbor may be considered to have constructive control of them. Next, the Penal Code defines reasonable belief. Reasonable belief is a belief that will be held by an ordinary and prudent person in the same circumstances as the actor. Finally, a cite order is a written or electronic instruction to pay money payable on demand or at a definite time, including a check, an electronic debit, or an automatic bank draft. This is the second of two screencasts covering various Texas Penal Code definitions. Once again, a reminder, there are dozens of definitions in Penal Code Section 1.07. We'll only cover some of the most important ones here. Please refer to Section 1.07 for the full list of definitions. First, a public place means any place to which the public or a substantial group of the public has access, including streets and highways, or common areas of schools, hospitals, apartments, offices, transport facilities, and shops. Pay close attention to the definition of public place. It's very specific. Privately owned property may still be considered a public place under the Penal Code. Consent means assent in fact, whether express or apparent. So, for instance, a person specifically giving another person permission to act. Effective consent includes consent by a person legally authorized to act for the owner. So, for instance, if one person gives another person the keys to their car, but doesn't give them explicit permission to drive it, but also doesn't tell them not to drive it, the act of giving the other person the keys may be considered effective consent. According to the Penal Code, consent is not effective if it is induced by force, threat, fraud, or given by a person the actor knows is not legally authorized to act for the owner. For instance, a child can't give consent or effective consent for a stranger to take the car of the child's mother or father. Consent is also not effective if it is given by a person who, by reason of youth, mental disease, defect, or intoxication, is known to be unable to make reasonable decisions, or given solely to detect the commission of an offense. So a car thief arrested for stealing a bait car cannot make a legal argument that a peace officer gave effective consent by leaving the bait car on the street. An actor is a suspect or defendant. An association is a government agency of two or more persons having a common economic interest. The Penal Code defines an individual as a human being who is alive, including an unborn child. A public servant is a person elected, selected, appointed, employed, or designated as an officer, employee, or agency of the government. Or, a public servant is also considered to be a juror or grand juror, an arbitrator or referee authorized by law or agreement to hear or determine a case or controversy, an attorney at law or notary public in the course of a government function, a candidate for nomination or election to public office, or a person performing a governmental function although not legally qualified to do so. A person is defined as an individual, corporation, association, or limited liability company. Next, an act is a bodily movement, whether voluntary or involuntary, including speech. Finally, an omission is a failure to act. The Penal Code addresses the issue of jurisdiction. While jurisdiction may seem a simple concept, there are a few unusual situations the Penal Code addresses in order to assert its ability to prosecute. We will discuss both the simple and the unusual in this screencast. First, the simple. Texas has jurisdiction over an offense if the conduct or the result that is an element of the offense happens in Texas, or the conduct outside of Texas constitutes an attempt to commit an offense inside Texas. For instance, if you buy a gun in North Dakota and then travel into Texas with the intent to commit murder, but are caught before you can actually kill someone, Texas can still prosecute you for attempted murder, even though your overt act took place outside of the state. Next, the Penal Code states Texas has jurisdiction over an offense if the conduct outside of Texas constitutes a conspiracy to commit an offense inside of Texas, and an act in furtherance of the conspiracy occurs inside of Texas. For example, if you conspire outside of Texas to kill a person inside of Texas, enter Texas and buy a gun for this purpose, but are stopped before the killing, Texas may still claim jurisdiction, even if the conspiracy started or was confined out of state. The Penal Code continues that Texas has jurisdiction over an offense if the conduct inside of Texas constitutes an attempt, solicitation, or conspiracy to commit a crime. These are called in-show offenses. It continues that Texas has jurisdiction over an offense if it establishes criminal responsibility for the commission of an offense in another jurisdiction that is also an offense in Texas. For instance, let's say two people conspire in Texas to kill someone in Virginia and buy a gun in Texas for this purpose, but they are stopped before they ever leave the state. Texas may still claim jurisdiction even though they intended for the killing to take place outside of Texas and charge them under Texas law with conspiracy to commit murder. Sometimes it is difficult to establish precisely where a criminal homicide was committed, particularly if a body is dumped somewhere other than the place where the killing occurred. In this case, the Penal Code states that if the body of a criminal homicide victim is found in Texas, it is presumed that the death occurred in Texas. Related to this, the Penal Code states that if death alone is the basis for jurisdiction, it is a defense to the exercise of jurisdiction that conduct is not criminal in the jurisdiction where it occurred. For example, let's say a body is found here in Texas, and the fact that it's found here is the only basis for jurisdiction. But it's determined the manner in which the death was caused occurred in Mexico, where the specific act which resulted in the death is not an offense. In a case like this, the defendant might be protected from prosecution on the basis that Texas doesn't have jurisdiction. Keep in mind, this scenario would be very unusual and is highly unlikely. The Penal Code addresses another rare possibility. It states an offense based on an omission to perform a duty imposed on an actor by Texas law is committed inside the state regardless of the location of the actor at the time of the offense. So for example, let's say a nursing home company headquartered out of state shuts down an in-state facility. In doing so, they fail to take several actions the Penal Code requires them to take pertaining to notifying the state, and residents suffer bodily injury as a result. Even though the persons responsible are physically out of state, the Penal Code asserts jurisdiction to prosecute them for their omissions that occurred out of state. Finally, in regards to jurisdiction, the Penal Code states Texas includes the land, water, and airspace above the land and water over which the state has power to define offenses.